Hi friends, and welcome back to Cammy's Corner and another installment of Harrowing Horror. So this is a very meaty book. There is a ton to talk about, so let's dive right in. This month's selection is The Stand. It was written in both 1978 originally and then reproduced in this uncut version in 1990. Both of the books were produced by Doubleday Publishing. Our author is none other than, of course, Mr. Stephen King. And he had a birthday in September, on the 21st to be exact. So happy 71st birthday to Stephen King. He said it was better to be 71 than dead. Love that. Our genre is post-apocalyptic horror, or just apocalyptic horror if you want to alleviate the post. Our point of view, it is written in third person limited. Our places are very vast. We start off in California, somewhere in the desert. We are then followed by places such as Texas, Utah, Maine, Georgia, Vermont, Colorado, Nevada, just to name a few. Now we have two various place settings, depending on the year of publication in which you read. Our 1978 version is going to be more of an 80s setting, so it is still set in present day. And then when the uncut version came out, we are looking at more of a 90s setting. The pages and chapters are going to vary, obviously, depending on the publication date in which you read. The number of pages for our original publication was 823. This guy here has 1,153 pages. I wasn't able to get an exact chapter count on the original publication. However, this one is comprised of 78 chapters, and it is broken down into 3 parts or books 1, 2, and 3. Now your price range is where it's going to get a little bit sticky. So if you want just to have a copy like I did, I picked this one up for $3. It is hardbound. It does have a really great dust jacket on it. There's no rips or tears. There's no staining. I mean, for the average collector of Stephen King's, this is a beautiful copy. And again, I picked this up used for $3. However, if you are looking to purchase Stephen King in the hardbound version for the purposes of collecting first editions, I want to warn you to be very careful. Through my research and trying to find price ranges for these books, I came across a multitude of forums for selling Stephen King books. Some are very reputable, others like eBay and Amazon, you don't exactly know what you're working with your seller. So be sure, if your purpose is to purchase first edition hardcover copies only, that you do your homework. Now, I don't have an original 1978 version to show you, but if you are interested in purchasing that, some things you want to look for is, remember, the original run was only 70,000 copies. It is 823 pages. It is going to be smaller in size than this here. You're looking at about a 5.75 by 8.5, and the width is going to be about a 1.9. Your dust jacket price, and dust jacket pricing for first edition copies is very important. You'll notice here I am missing a pricing where the uncut version should have a price of $24.95. Mine is sans that. However, if you look on the copyright page, it gives you information indicating that the first edition publications had already been previously published. But on a first edition 1978, the dust jacket price is going to be $12.95. It is quarter bound, and by quarter bound, that's where you're going to see a differentiation of kind of like a cardboard setting and a cloth setting. The difference on the 1978 version is it's simply going to say The Stand in the direct center, and you're going to have Stephen King's name on the top, and it's going to say just Doubleday. There's no Doubleday emblem. It just says Doubleday on the bottom. On page 822, well, really between 822 and 823, inside the spine, so like as if you had the book open like this, inside the crevice or the crease of the spine, on the very bottom between 822 and 823, you're going to see on the very bottom a T39. If that T39 is not there, it is not in fact a first edition copy. Also on your copyright page, the very last item will say first edition. If all of that checks out, you're looking at a value of about $450 to $700. if you want to purchase one, be prepared to pay about $400 to $4,000. Now $4,000 of course is on the very high end of things. That would be if it is in the coffin edition, and the coffin edition is when it's bagged and boarded. It'll come in a really beautiful black casing, and it will also of course have Stephen King's signature. There are a few copies that I found online that do have Stephen King's signature, but again, you want to authenticate. Have proof. See if they can provide you a certificate of authenticity, a photograph of the day that it was, you know, possibly taken. Sometimes they do purchase it from other people, so you might not always be able to verify, but you can always contact Stephen King's personnel and they would be able to verify in fact, bona fide signature or not. The only difference on the uncut version for first editions is the end pages. Oh, your end pages in this first edition of the 78 would be white. In this 1990 complete and uncut version, your end pages are going to be red. Otherwise, that's really the only difference. And a first edition copy of this uncut version right now is only valued at about between $50 and $70. So you can see there's a huge difference in between the, you know, publications and all the fine details that really give you the value of your book. So this book is vast. It is broken down in a very interesting way. So I'm going to do the book breakdown before we actually dive into this book. Excuse me. Don't know what's going on with me today. Okay, so our book breakdown, we start off, and I'm going to be explaining it, of course, from the uncut version because that is obviously the version that I read. You have two prefaces. The first is part 1, and it is to be read before purchase. I absolutely love this because this is really Stephen King's humor coming out full throttle. He kind of, in a sense, talks you out of buying the book. Of course, we go into part 2, preface, which is, of course, if you chose to buy the book, and we all know that we're going to buy Stephen King's books if you walk into a bookstore with that intent. It's then followed up by a series of lyrics. Our lyrics are Bruce Springsteen with Jungle Land of 1975, Blue Oyster Cult with Don't Fear the Reaper, 1976, and Country Joe and the Fish with the Fish Cheer song, better known as the Vietnam song of 1967. The circle opens, followed by what appears to be a line out of a poem or perhaps a quote from a book. We need help, the poet reckoned, Edward Dorn. We're then followed by a short story of an introduction of 3 very important characters, Charlie, Sally, and baby Levon. This kind of takes us to the opening sequence and what we are to expect with this story, followed then by another caption labeled Captain Trips, with the date range of June 16th through July 4th, 1990. Followed up then by another series of lyrics by The Silvers, Boogie Fever, 1975, Larry Underwood, Baby Can You Dig Your Man? That of course is a fictional character here within our story. And we open up with book 1. Book 1 is comprised of chapters 1 through 42, which takes us into On the Border. On the Border is date range July 5th through September the 6th of 1990, followed again by another set of lyrics, Paul Simon, American Tune, 1973, and Chuck Berry, Back in the USA, 1978. That takes us into book 2, chapters 43 to 60, and The Stand. This caption is dated September 7th, 1990 through January 10th, 1991. We're then followed up by another set of lyrics by Woody Guthrie, This Land is Your Land, 1945. A quote from the book by a fictional character, Carly Yates. Hey Trash, what did old lady Semple say when you torched her pension check? This of course is a fictional character within our story. And Ben E. King, Stand By Me, 1962. Lastly, followed up with our final book, book 3, chapters 61 to 78, where chapter 78 is the first chapter that we actually see a title for. It's entitled Mayday, and that's followed by another small caption that states Dusk of a Summer Evening. Then we close with The Circle Closes, with the same quote that opened the circle, We need help, the poet reckoned, Edward Dorn, and that is our end. Now the circle opens and closes with the same quote. If you really read that quote, it does suit for both the beginning and the end. So I liked how Stephen King chose to use that same quote because they needed help then and they really need help now. We went from not knowing what was going on to basically rebuilding. Now on the fictional character tie-in for Carly Yates. I have not read this series, but for those Stephen King fans out there that have, you may have been kind of familiarized with Carly Yates, as it is said that that character ties into the Dark Tower series, Dark Tower 6 to be exact, The Wizard and Glass. There is a portion of that story where you are told about Captain Trips and kind of how when Tet arrives in the world, it's ravaged by Captain Trips. So there is said to many times that Stephen King does do that with his books, where he ties in one thing to another. They don't really have anything to do with one another, but it just kind of shows you that his world is coexisting. So that's pretty cool. So if you happen to catch that, awesome. If you didn't catch it, not a problem. I haven't read it, so you know, it was just an extra for me. Excuse me. All right. So this is an apocalyptic story. Like I said, apocalyptic, post-apocalyptic, however you want to look at it. The apocalypse is one of those unique horror stories that is really appealing to all humans because it is of a human intrinsic value. When you read a typical horror story, like something of vampires or maybe werewolves, that is not always the most believable story because in the back of your mind, you know that those things don't exist. But when you're reading something about a flu virus that was tampered with by the US government, that becomes a lot more believable. Something that you feel honestly could happen within your lifetime. So that starts getting your gears turning and you start thinking about biological weapons and weapons of mass destruction, how our government really works, who you are. If an apocalypse happens, when it happens, are you ready? Are you prepared? Do you have enough supplies? If this happens and you're left alone, how strong are you going to be? Are you going to be a leader? Are you going to be a follower? You have all these burning questions, so you start to really become part of this story. I love Stephen King for that reason. He is such a believable writer, and I think that's why so many authors try desperately to get inside his head, and it is something that just cannot be compared. It cannot be duplicated. He lives life on a different beat. He goes the extra mile to not only incorporate lyrics and scenery and people, but he humanizes people to the point that as you're reading his stories, the imagery is so vivid, you can really place yourself in that story. You start to get, you know, a hyperventilation in your body when, you know, something's about to happen, or when a character dies off, you feel a connection to them. I hadn't read Stephen King in a long time, but I can tell you it was like falling back into one of my favorite books, and I've never read The Stand. I was blown away by the amount of detail in this story, and don't get me wrong, it is racist. It is not at all politically correct. And quite frankly, I was really surprised, despite the fact that it was, you know, recut and added in, old characters were given new dialogue, that a lot of that was not removed. But despite that, the book is still a huge success. Now, not to say that that's going to resonate with everybody, and that really does go to show you where we were in 1990 as a society to where we are today, because that would definitely not fly in today's standards. But it was refreshing to see that maybe because it was just Stephen King, that story was just left intact the way that it was intended to be told. It is amazing. So as we develop here our story, we have a flu virus. It's a very strong, almost like a supercharged, genetically mutated flu virus. The intent was to maintain containment at a US military installation. Unfortunately, there was an outbreak within that installation. Had our main intro character, as we now refer to as Patient Zero, done his job and closed the gate, this would have never happened and our story would have simply been a novella. But of course we know that that doesn't happen with Stephen King. Everything is elaborate and big, and well, we don't go home with him. We have a instance where a soldier had a job, All he had to do was gate guard, close the gate, there's a contamination, do what you've been trained to do 1,000 times. We're now live, we're real action. He chose to be that person. Oh, I'm not infected, I'm okay. Let me get myself and my family out before this hits. Not knowing that he was also a carrier. He was also contaminated. So this strain of the flu virus that is now broken out, it was developed by the US government with the intent to be a biological weapon. It now escapes from this testing facility and leaks out into the United States. The communicability rate is 99.4% effective. That means that 0.6% of the population, that's less than 10% of the population, will be immune to this virus. Those are fantastic odds. But also being genetically mutated, that also leaves a very slim possibility of an antidote virus being created to cure this. So we have a situation where we explode now into the United States. How is this going to affect the population? This really boils down to a very simple premise. It's a battle between good and evil. We've seen it time and time again. You have a situation in an apocalyptic setting based on human error, and you have humans validating their errors, either trying to create cover-ups, trying to save themselves, or trying to rebuild or destroy what is left of what they knew. So we see here that the survivors in America are then drawn to a good community with Mother Abigail in Boulder, Colorado. And then you have the evil community, which is comprised and housed and headed towards Las Vegas, which I think is genius. Sin City, I mean, hello, that's awesome. Led by this demonic super villain, Randall Flagg, known as the Dark Man. And it's really about who's going to overtake whom. That is really what The Stand is all about. And this is one of those stories that just captivated audience. This is actually grazed multiple lists as being a favored book of all time by American readers. So that just goes to show you how apocalyptic horror really resonates with people. Now let's kind of dive into our characters, shall we? Excuse me. I have a little bit of a bloody nose too. These characters are so vast, they are so rich, and to not do justice by talking about these characters almost seems like I'm doing an injustice to this story. But there's just not enough time to go into great depth and detail about all of these characters, or I'd keep you here for hours, and my videos are already long enough when it comes to these harrowing horror discussions. So I'm just going to highlight a few characters that I think really made the story and carried it through to its end, because without these characters we really wouldn't have a story. So we've already begun by talking about the soldier champion, and you had one job, Charles, just one job, and you couldn't even do that. So Patient Zero kind of leads us into talking about some other forms of Project Blue, and that is General Starkey. General Starkey was the commanding officer in charge of this entire project. He was very much aware that once the super flu was on the loose, it was going to be impossible to control with the constant mutations and the genetic creations, and that's essentially, it was doing its job. That's the way they created it to be. So being that it worked so well, and he was seeing the actual after effects of how it was working, he just kind of decided, okay, well, if you can't beat them, join them. So he went to great lengths to fabricate many different ways of trying to combat the information from leaking that it was he and his crew that were responsible for this pandemic. So he first orders the media to give this false story. So there's proof, kids. Don't pay attention to everything you see on the media and on the news, because it's not always true. And that doesn't work. So then he has this contingency plan that he's going to create this elaborate scheme to send the virus to other countries so that there is a way to somehow conceal the original origin of the virus being centered as America, as being the original carrier of the virus, that gets sent up to the White House. The White House isn't having anything to do with it. So they say, no, Starkey, this is on you, buddy. You had a job. You had a command that you were in charge of. You failed, and now you fix it. So his solution to this problem, he commits suicide. He does have kind of a right-hand man, if you will, and that is Major Len Crichton. In the original 78 version of The Stand, the character, it goes by the name of Major Len Carlsley. So that is a differentiation in this. But really, that is the gist of Project Blue. And then we kind of have the breakdown of the good versus the evil. And for our good is housed, initially they're all over the United States, but their dreams all lead them to Nebraska, and from Nebraska, Mother Abigail kind of conforms this people that are immune to Captain Trips, and then they make their way to Boulder, Colorado. So let's start with our main protagonist, and that is Mother Abigail. Abigail Fremantle, known to her followers, if you will, as Mother Abigail, and she leads these good survivors of this super flu to Nebraska through dreams. She comes to them as she claims she is a prophet of God, and she tells them to come and meet her here. And once they are in Nebraska, they form this alliance, if you will, and together they travel to Boulder, Colorado, where inevitably they create this Boulder Free Zone government. Now, she does claim to be a prophet of God. There's no mistaking with that. However, she does start to feel this sense of guilt because she feels that, in essence, these people that she's come to in these dreams are looking at her as a sort of God-like individual. So she feels a sense of pride, and pride, of course, is one of the deadly sins. So during this, she exiles herself from the commune, if you will, and she goes off to the wilderness, not to be seen or heard from. When she finally does make an attempt to come back and be a part of the committee, she at this point is pretty much on her deathbed. She does have one final premonition. However, there's no prediction as to what the outcome of this will be. So this leads these 4 individuals that she advises are to carry out this journey westward and confront Flag and kind of finish it, if you will. She does indicate who those 4 men will be, but she does not indicate who will fall out, but one will fall out before reaching Las Vegas. She does all of this at the ripe old age of 108. However, in the miniseries, she is depicted as being 106. So clearly 108 is too old for Hollywood. We also have Stu, good old Stuart Redman. Stuart Redman is played by Gary Sinise in the miniseries. And he was a good choice because Stuart is a quiet, intelligent individual. He comes across as being the first man discovered to be completely immune to the super flu. Over time, though, he becomes very indignant, and Gary Sinise plays that very well. You see this possibly because he feels maybe some sort of guilt for being immune to this. He doesn't quite understand it as he's trying to understand and conceptualize everything that's going on around him and dealing with the fact that things just aren't the same. Then coming to know that, hey, I don't have what everybody else has, and I'm not going to get what everybody else has. He goes under a severe amount of testing because the government does take control of him. Government authorities then take him to the CDC center in Atlanta, then follow that up by taking him to a town in Vermont. This is not a real city in Vermont, it's Silvington, Vermont, and there is like a CDC plague center of sorts. He undergoes, again, a massive amount of testing and blood work, to where at that facility he does manage to escape both dying and undergoing any further testing. And it is there that he meets up with characters that he later works with in the story, such as Francis, Glenn, Kojak, of course, being Glenn's right-hand dog, Harold. And we see Stu's evolution as being one of the powerhouse members of the Fantastic Four, as we want to maybe look at them. He is one that is sought out in Mother Abigail's premonition that he needs to head west and take on Flag. So you see this journey where he inevitably is the one that falls out due to a broken leg. He also experiences pneumonia, hypothermia. Eventually, through the help of Kojak, who Glenn leaves behind to kind of watch over him, Tom rescues him, and Tom, through a vision of Nick Andros, is able to bring him back to health and lead him back to Boulder, Colorado. Inevitably, we do see that Redman and Goldsmith end up together, and she not only has the child that she was with when they met, but then they also have a child together. And from the way that the story depicts, they go back to her town in Maine and begin a life there, and probably reconstruct Maine as it is, and their family. Frances Goldsmith. So Frances is an interesting character. She's portrayed in the miniseries by Molly Ringwald. She is, of course, from Maine, and she has a very interesting relationship with her father. Of course, she's pregnant right off the bat. She's in this kind of on-again, off-again relationship with this gentleman by the name of Jess. You can tell very early on from the conversation she's having with her father that she's not very much into this guy, and she really isn't sure from the beginning if she even wants to keep the child. But at that point, there's a lot going on, so it just kind of becomes, okay, well, I'm just going to truck on and see what happens. In the miniseries, her mother is not present, but in the book, her mother is. She has a very bitter relationship with her mom. That's something that I honestly enjoyed, the fact that it was not in the miniseries. Her mom is dead 7 years in the miniseries, versus in the book, there's just a tug of war kind of between the relationship that she has with her father and the way her mother sees her. Fortunately, it wasn't always that way with her mother. It was, ever since her brother had passed, that she kind of took on this new, almost angelic-like religious protocol, and was very judgmental towards Frances. You do often hear Frances referred to as Franny, and I think that really is just to kind of keep her innocence about her and to keep her youth throughout the story. And she does have a beautiful relationship with her father, and you do see that also resonate in the miniseries. As book and miniseries will agree, Franny ends up burying her father, who succumbs to the superflu, in his garden. And in the book, of course, her mother also does succumb to the superflu. So with the loss of her parents and being what appears to be the only survivor in Maine, she realizes that Harold Lauder is also a survivor. Now, we all know that he has a very unrequited love for Goldstein and wants to marry her and whatever else with her, but she does not return the love or even see him in that way. And together, as the two survivors, move on westward to Vermont, where they meet up, of course, with Redman. That becomes in itself a love triangle of sorts, where Redman isn't even sure at first he likes Franny or wants to be with her in that way. But in an apocalyptic situation, you kind of have to weigh it out. You don't have a lot of options at that point. So your selection pool from the 0.6% of people that are immune to this superflu, you kind of got to pick from that gene pool. So he and Franny get together, obviously, and go on to have a family of their own. But that causes some havoc for Harold, which we'll talk about him in a moment. We also have Nick, who is a prominent character. Nick is someone who was originally slated in Mother Abigail's vision to be one of the 4 that go on to defeat Flag. Unfortunately, Flag got to him before he could carry out what would inevitably be his final mission. Andros does, in essence, kind of stand up to Flag by, in the end, coming in a vision to Tom Cullen, and he gives Cullen all of the needed information to move forth to find Redman and nurse him back to health. Now, in the movie, Nick Andros is played by Rob Lowe, who does a really good job. He is deaf-mute, so he has no ability to hear or to speak, but he does a phenomenal job gracing through that. And the dialogue is really good for someone who has no ability to communicate. Of course, he is able to write things down to communicate with people, but being that his part in this was so significant, and he has 2 major senses that are void, he does a fantastic job of carrying through his mission. Also a difference is Nick in the miniseries is indicated to be from Ridley, Pennsylvania, and in the book he's obviously from Nebraska. So I guess Stephen King didn't want the protagonist, Mother Abigail, and one of our main characters to be from the same area. M-O-O-N spells Nebraska. Tom Cullen in the miniseries portrayed by Bill Fagerbakke. Bill by nature plays very kind of dorky, dumb characters, so for him to play this character of Tom Cullen really made a lot of sense. He did it very well. Of course, Tom, as you know, suffers from mild to moderate mental retardation. In the book, of course, it's just simply he's a retard, and it also states that in the miniseries. Now, of course, politically correct purposes, this would not be sufficient for today's standards, but it remained in the uncut version. Cullen has an ability beyond his disability to slip into these self-hypnosis where he's able to make connections that he can't while he's awake or living. And this is something that he uses his disability to get him in with Flag, so that gets him into Las Vegas. In an attempt to ensure that Cullen's story is believable, to get him into Flag's cult, if you will, there is a hypnosis that takes place, allowing Tom to know that M-O-O-N spells moon, and that eventually is what leads him to Redmond. And of course we know he nurses Redmond back to health, taking him back to Colorado. Larry Underwood, portrayed in the miniseries by Adam Stork, is a singer who is up and coming. So he's kind of a young, cocky fellow who is coming up on the Billboard charts with Baby Can You Dig Your Man. And here we see through Underwood's story that he has a disapproving mother, and that's definitely portrayed in the miniseries. But he does have a prominent setting in this story. He does manage to escape New York City. This is where he meets up with Nadine Cross, and he and Nadine, of course, make their way to Vermont, where they meet up with the likes of Redmond and Goldsmith. He inevitably ends up becoming one of the four to face Flag in the finale. Now, we mentioned Harold earlier. Harold, of course, is about 16 years old. He lives in Ogunquit, Maine. He is the younger brother of Franny's best friend, Amy, and he's deemed pretty much a social outcast. He's a little weird. After, of course, the super flu wipes out the entire population of his town in Maine, he and Franny then head to Vermont, where he kind of sees himself as her protector. When they meet up with Redmond initially, he refuses Stu. He rejects him completely. He even attempts to bring out a gun and threaten him with it. But over time, he learns to kind of reconcile his relationship with Redmond, and from there, they make their way to Nebraska and then, of course, on to Boulder. He does attempt between this journey to profess his love to Franny, which is immediately rejected. He does, for a while though, become a respected member of the Boulder community, but he has a very difficult time just letting go of his self-esteem issues from the past and knowing that he was a social outcast. So bring this into where we enter in Nadine Cross, and she plays on his insecurities, and this really works to her benefit as well as to Flag's benefit, as she seduces him into carrying out Flag's wishes, which is to build a bomb to destroy the Free Zone Committee, the FZC, and he creates a bomb that detonates. It kills 7 people, and he and Cross then flee with an attempt to go to Vegas. Well, it is stated in a kind of obscure way that Flag kind of creates this accident, this motorcycle accident, as he and Cross are attempting to enter into Vegas, and Nadine essentially abandons him. So it leaves him in a situation where he realizes that he's going to die anyways. So he writes a note kind of taking responsibility for his actions, despite the fact that, you know, at this point Redmond doesn't trust him, Underwood doesn't trust him. He's really lost the trust of his community, but he doesn't have any time to backtrack and explain the situation. So in the note he attempts to say that he was undermined and proceeds to commit suicide. Miss Nadine, of course, is the virgin. She's the private school teacher from New Hampshire. She retains her virginity because she is slated to be destined to be with Flag. She, of course, as I stated, learns to undermine Harold, but before Harold, she does have this weird attraction to Larry Underwood. She knows that she has to remain pure for Flag, so when they eventually reach Boulder, Colorado, she starts to succumb to her understanding and purpose of being with Flag and how she needs to be for him. So she uses Lauder for her purposes to attempt the assassination and, of course, eliminate committee members, and then makes her way to Las Vegas. Glenn, who is part of the Fantastic Four and played in the miniseries by Ray Walston, he is a professor of sociology and he's in his retirement years. He goes into retirement well before the super flu ever hits, but he is arthritic, so this handicap does take effect as he's trying to make his purpose and way within the Boulder community. He does become part of the reform committee, and then later he is one of the four who is destined to meet Flag for the finality in Las Vegas. There's also his dog Kojak. Now Kojak becomes his dog through adoption because Kojak's original master died with the super flu, so he eventually serves a greater part within the four, as he's not only Glenn's companion, but he also is there for Stu as he's recovering from his broken leg, and then goes on to join Cullen and Redmond as they make their attempt back to Boulder, Colorado. And then finally in the four, we have Ralph Bretner, who's played by Peter Van Norden in the miniseries. He is a farmer. He's also a U.S. Army vet. He is captured by Flag in the end, along with Bateman and Underwood. And it is within that finality that we see this big explosion, which I'll talk about on the evil side of things. Now again, there's still plenty of good characters that I didn't mention, but there's just no time to get into everybody. So the last two characters that I'm going to talk about are our prominent evil characters. So we're not going to start with the big daddy, we're going to start with the sidekick. We have Lloyd Henrid, and Lloyd in the miniseries is played by Miguel Ferrer. He was made more of like a honky redneck in the book, but Miguel does a different take on him. He's kind of more of a charming, believable, kind of a petty criminal, you know, hasn't really done too much. Honestly, hanging around with Poke, it seems like Poke is more of the criminal than he is. He ends up getting thrown in jail, and it is Flag who rescues him from starvation. So he becomes kind of like Flag's right-hand man, the second in charge, if you will. He runs several of the day-to-day activities in Vegas. He oversees operations at the military base. He attributes all of this ability to Flag. It's almost a way of saying thank you for saving my life. There is a point where his loyalty is tested and he is given the opportunity to leave Vegas with several friends. However, respects the decision of those who choose to leave and does not inform Flag of those who are going to abandon the mission, but decides to stay planted in Vegas to his loyalty to Flag. He does end up having to shoot Bateman, which Bateman's final words to Henrid were, "It's all right, Mr. Henrid, you don't know any better." Those words are really portrayed very well in the miniseries because you can see it kind of deeply resonates with Lloyd. And of course, Lloyd's final words in the end are, "Oh shit, we're all fucked." And of course, the man of the hour, our antagonist, Mr. Darkman himself, the tall man, the walking dude, Mr. Randall Flagg. Flag is the quintessential Antichrist. His goal is just death, dismemberment, destruction, all abroad. He is presented as the opposition, of course, to Mother Abigail, and he is the profession of evil. His appearance shifts from human, demon, and other various animals, and this is implied throughout the story as he makes his transformations. It's kind of, in a sense, stated that he's lived many lives, because there are some connections, though he doesn't have a memory per se before Captain Trips. There is variations where he'll indicate being a Marine, being part of the Ku Klux Klan, also the Vietnam War, and even the Manson family. So it shows you that he's kind of lived the tale of time. Now, Flag appears to survivors just like Mother Abigail. However, when he comes to them in their dreams, he provides them with the choices. He's typically drawn to those who already have a taste for destruction or for immense power. So, of course, he uses Lloyd for this very reason. He saves him from starvation in prison and makes him basically his second in command in Las Vegas. At the end of this big epic battle of good and evil, you do have kind of a showdown. And this is really where the remaining of the four have made their descent into Vegas. And you finally have this standoff where you have to ask, where you're asking yourself, is good going to prevail or is evil going to take over? Flag is portrayed by Jamie Sheridan in the miniseries, and he does a really good job, although he kind of looks like Michael Bolton. But he does a good job of keeping it quirky to where you kind of love him and you kind of hate him at the same time, but inevitably you know that he is the evil one. So all of this climactic uprising and upheaval, we end with a showdown in Vegas. So we have where Flag is gradually starting to show signs of loss of power, and at the end, the hand of God detonates a nuclear bomb that explodes over Vegas, destroying Flag, destroying all of his followers, and inevitably Las Vegas. Maybe that's how the world's really gonna end. Maybe Las Vegas, Sin City, as it's been named for decades, is going to finally succumb to the hand of God. I have to say though, having rewatched the miniseries, that scene was just as cheesy today as watching it when I was 13. So I know what you're saying. You left out so many significant bad guy characters, and I get it. I didn't talk about the trash can man, we didn't get to the kid, Julie, Whitney, Jenny, Barry, and they're all significant. They all play a phenomenal role in this storytelling and the process. There's just no time. I mean, this video is probably already about an hour long, but I do want to quickly touch on the mini-series because, of course, anytime there is a great classic, there is always a potential possibility of talks of a remake, and this is a particular one that has been discussed for quite some time by the likes of David Yates and Ben Affleck, just to name a couple. So will there be a remake? Well, as of right now on the table, Josh Boone, who directed A Fault in Our Stars, is a huge Stephen King fan, and he would really like the opportunity to remake this. Now, it wouldn't be a movie, it would probably be something similar to the TV miniseries that we had here. Nothing over like about a 10-hour. CBS is confirming they have in fact picked it up for 2019. Now, originally when this went to the drawing board, it was in discussion that Matthew McConaughey would be picking up the role of Randall Flagg. Now, as you know, McConaughey played Flagg in The Gunslinger, which was a huge flop. And so being that it wasn't a success for McConaughey, I very seriously doubt he would even be interested, but this is definitely up for a potential remake. As far as our book, I give this 5 stars. 5 out of 5 stars, hands down. There's just so much detail, and just, it's amazing to me every time I open a Stephen King book, whether I read them back to back or like this. I haven't picked up Stephen King in years, but I fall into the story every time I read it. He writes his characters so believable, and in my opinion, every Stephen King book that is written is made for TV or made for a movie. He just gives a phenomenal amount of life and detail to each of his characters. So I'm sorry, kids, stop asking Stephen King to get inside of his head and figure out how he writes, because he cannot be duplicated. He is simply one of a kind. So, all right, let's pick our new selection, shall we? Oh, dropped it. Sorry, guys. All right, let's see what it is. Let's see what it is. It is, ooh, cool. I've been wanting to read this one. This has been on my radar. The Turn of the Screw, Henry James. So this one should be a relatively small read. It is 100 and, wait, that's an after, yeah, well, afterwards part of it. So 146 pages. Again, Henry James, The Turn of the Screw. Until next time, friends. I mean, I'm gonna be okay, right?